normal military installation where if you've got business there, you know, you can be allowed on the base and things like that. But Larry went public a number of years later and said that just after his experience, he was ordered to go to the base car parking area, and something strange happened. He got into this car and he said he suddenly felt weird and drugged, groggy, as if he was sort of in a semi-faint type situation. And he said that what happened was that he felt really groggy, as if he'd been drugged in some fashion, and was taken to another part of the base which had an elevator in it. And he said he had this feeling of going deep underground. He said he could feel his ears popping. You know, so it's sort of a significant change in pressure. And he said he was taken to this underground installation where he saw a craft like the one seen in the woods, deep below the base. And he said he also saw behind this sort of large glass window, if you like, against this strange creature, which supposedly spoke with him telepathically and said that there was a tunnel extending out deep below the base to the English North Sea, and there'd been an alien presence in the area since, I think, the 1930s or something like that, and that it was all a matter of, you know, deep secrecy, etc., etc., and there were various other such secret installations around the world. And then Larry was taken from the building, taken back to his dormitory, and that was the last thing he remembered before he woke up. So, you know, we do know that there are, like at many military bases, you know, they have underground bunkers and things like that. That's not necessarily anything strange. You know, it's either done to contain, you know, weapons, you know, military, nuclear weapons, atomic weapons, silos, that sort of thing. You know, the sort of really you know, strong weaponry, etc., is held deep underground. So there's nothing strange in that respect about military bases having bunkers and vaults. You know, it'd be strange if they didn't, actually. But this other story, you know, sort of takes the existence of these underground vaults to a different level. Now, today, Bentwaters is closed down. You know, the US presence, for the most part, isn't in Britain anymore. And it was turned over to a private company, and, you know, the old buildings are now sort of hired out for offices and that sort of thing. So we know, you know, Bentwaters existed. You know, we can go, it has a history. And it did have underground installations. The big question is, you know, to what extent did those underground installations extend? You know, was the UFO story true, or was Larry sort of rendered into this weird altered state again as some sort of weird mind trip in the same way as Bob Lazar? You know, this is one of the interesting things, that a lot of the people who've come forward with these stories aren't just relating interesting stories, but something weird happened to them when they had the experience, you know, and you have to wonder, was it some sort of stage managed, like a theatre production, if you like, to try and instill one particular theory, or were they really exposed to something genuinely alien underground? Now, one other place I'm just going to focus on briefly in England is a place called Royal Air Force Rudloe Manor. And Rudloe Manor is located in the county of Wiltshire, not too far from Stonehenge. It's only about a 20-minute drive from Stonehenge, something like that. And that's an overhead photograph of the base, or part of it. And again, it looks just like a normal, innocuous military installation. But Rudloe Manor has an intriguing background. It was for many years, the headquarters of the British Royal Air Force's Provost and Security Services, which is basically the British equivalent to the American Air Force Office of Special Investigations, who get involved in, like, criminal investigations and espionage related issues and things like this. Now, the area where Rudloe Manor is built, it wasn't sort of a coincidence or just at random why the base was built where it was. Not too far away is a large, very old English city called Bath. And if you ever go to Bath, all the buildings are built in one particular type of stone, which is called Bath stone. And of course they had to get the stone from somewhere. So what they did, they quarried out an entire part of England near to where Rudloe Manor, or actually where Rudloe Manor now is, to build the city of Bath. So obviously when all the stone was removed, what you had were these huge underground caverns and tunnels and caves, which are just empty space. And in the 1940s, or at the end of the Second World War, during which time it had been used for, like, weapons storage and emergency storage of just regular wartime bombs and things like that, when the Soviets again became a big threat in the 50s, the thought was, well, you know, why don't we use these tunnels? Why don't we sort of quarry them out even further, make it sort of a really sort of huge underground hub installation, and use it in the event there's a nuclear attack on the country. It could be somewhere where, for example, a continuation of government could be carried on from. There are also plans to take the royal family there, while the rest of us unfortunately fry above the surface, but that's beside the point. That's always the case. And so in other words, it would be like an emergency management location in the event of a national disaster. But what's interesting is that a number of people have come forward who worked at Rudloe Manor and said that during the course of their work deep below ground, they saw, or they were exposed to, either photographs or saw literally, these weird sort of long missile type tanks about 12 to 13 feet long that contain what looked like cryogenically frozen alien bodies. And you know, they kind of discussed them in the same way that people have talked about them over here in the US, sort of small, large heads just laid out in these tanks with sort of frosted glass. And again, the people, you know, were shown this and told, this is one of our big secrets, and you know, this is what's going on under here. Now again, you know, this story is sort of an interesting one, but a weird one as well, because some of the people who were exposed to these tanks, and the photographs even, basically said there was no reason for me to be exposed to it. You know, it wasn't like it was part of their regular work. It was more along the lines of one of the people said, hey, you know, do you want to see something interesting? And the person having access to this location. And this actually made a number of the people wonder, again, if there was a specific reason why they were being shown this. You know, was it a test of their loyalty to see if they then spoke out with family, friends, etc.? And if they did, they obviously wouldn't be a good choice for security issues. If they stayed silent, you know, they might be somebody who then could be brought into another program and another program if they could keep their mouths shut. So again, you know, we have to wonder. Some people actually wondered if these bodies weren't even real, if they were like dummies, mannequins, created again to sort of test the loyalty of the person, show them something strange, and then sit back and see if they start telling the newspapers, whoever. If they stay quiet, well, you know, all well and good. And if they, in a worst case scenario, they do speak out, no real secrets have ever been really compromised. So again, you know, we have another angle where trying to sift the truth from the disinformation and the rumour mill, it becomes very, very difficult. And it's equally so with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton, Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, basically was from where between 1947 and 1969 the government or the Air Force ran its three publicly acknowledged UFO programs called Project Sign, Project Grudge and Project Blue Book. You know, there's a lot of rumours and stories about classified UFO programs that the government's supposedly involved in, but all of these have been denied apart from the three official ones, which the government closed down in 1969 when they said that there was no evidence ever found that, number one, UFOs existed, or that, number two, they presented any sort of threat to national security. And so the response was, there's no point in us keep investigating them. After 22 years, we would have found the evidence. Now, of course, the response of the UFO community is, well, you did find the evidence, you're just not telling us. And kind of like with Area 51, and specifically with Rudloe Manor, Wright-Patterson has an alien body angle to it, and it deals with something that's become known as Hangar 18. Now, contrary to what a lot of people think, there is no huge hangar at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base with a big number 18 painted on the side. You know, that would be sort of just too good, you know, if there was. Hangar 18 is sort of like a generic term that's been created by the UFO community to basically describe what are described to us as a large series of intricate and winding vaults and tunnels below Wright-Patterson, where again alien bodies and alien UFO wreckage and debris is allegedly held below the base. And the stories are interesting because they very closely mirror the ones from Rudloe about these bodies being stored in cryogenic tanks. You know, I'm sure everybody's seen science programs where people, you know, donate the bodies after death or plan to, and you know, they freeze the body, hopefully want to wake them up 200 years from now? Well, obviously this scenario is a bit different. It's basically the stories that the bodies are preserved so they can be medically studied and analysed to see, what's going on. Now, again, people say, well, these are just, Mr. X type stories, deep throat stories. We can never track the person down who made the claim. That's actually not true. A lot of the people who worked at Wright-Patterson who've come forward have done so under their real names. Even people outside of the military, very famous people. One of them, Senator Barry Goldwater, who was also a Republican nominee for president. He had a deep personal interest in UFOs. And he knew by his own admission, he knew all about the stories or the legends about what was supposedly stored deep below Wright-Patterson. And he approached one of his friends, General Curtis LeMay, who was a legendary figure in the US Air Force, and also a good friend of Goldwater's. And Goldwater said to him, I've heard all these rumours about what's supposedly going on under Wright-Patterson. I've heard about this vault, and these banks of bodies, etc. I want to see what's under there. I want to see it. I want to see the final proof after having a belief in UFOs for so long. Can I see it? And Goldwater actually went on the record. He was actually interviewed on Larry King. I think you can find the footage on YouTube even now. And LeMay said to him, not only no, but hell no, and don't ever ask me again. And recognising, the nature of how national security works, Goldwater backed down. He didn't sort of, stand up and make a confrontation. He was just, okay, I understand. It's something that's a sensitive issue. I won't ask it again. And he stayed silent for like 15 years. And then when the story kind of leaked out, and people began to ask him, even to UFO researchers, he said, well, yeah, I did. I asked the question and I got the brush off. And it wasn't just a brush off of, this is just stupid, let's go and just have lunch now. It was, don't ever ask that question again. And in a later letter, Goldwater elaborated and said that LeMay told him, I can't go there and you can't go there. And that was, just basically saying, whoever can go there, it's obviously some deep elite number of people. Now, other stories have surfaced about Wright-Patterson, again from military people coming forward from the 40s to pretty much the 70s. What's interesting, after the 1980s for the most part, we don't really get any stories, or hardly any, about people talking about seeing these bodies at Wright-Patterson. A number of military people have come forward to claim that in the late 1970s all the bodies and the wreckage and everything was secretly removed from Wright-Patterson and taken to another location, because there are stories that a number of these bodies have been scattered at various bases around the US over the years for national security reasons. Say for example they're all housed at one place and a disaster happened at that place, well, you've lost all your evidence. So the idea was scatter it around, and then it stands a better chance of being preserved, but equally possibly keeps the UFO research community chasing their tails because there's so many rumours coming from so many different bases. But the story with Wright-Patterson is that perhaps the material evidence was all removed back in the late 70s, if of course it really exists. And again, that's one of the big questions about Wright-Patterson. Now, Ken mentioned earlier the UFO Hunters program. And some of you may have seen the episode when they went to a place called Dulce in New Mexico. And Dulce, New Mexico has been the site of a number of highly controversial legends and stories and tales over the years. That supposedly in this huge mesa called Archuleta Mesa, which sort of looms over the town of Dulce, which is in northern New Mexico. The story is that deep inside the mesa and deep below it, there's this huge underground installation. Unlike every other installation I sort of talk about in the book, this one allegedly doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of the US government, but is supposedly controlled by hostile aliens who are sort of doing all sorts of bizarre experimentation on people. And it sounds like something out of the, your worst sci-fi nightmare movie type thing. And on that subject, there's actually a movie coming out this year on the Dulce base. It's called Top Secret Umbra. And I think it's coming out this year, or it may be next year, but it sort of tells the story of the base and the legends. And the the stories are sort of highly controversial. Supposedly the base extends to like 15 or 16 levels, and military personnel who claim to work there said they saw people in cages and subjected to all sorts of experiments, which of course, you know, if you're going to make such claims like that, then we need evidence to sort of back it up. So that's why a lot of people have sort of dug into this, because the stakes potentially are that high. Now, a lot of people who haven't really sort of dug into the Dulce story dismiss it outright. You know, they say there's just no way this could happen. You know, there's no way that hostile aliens exist, are living deep under New Mexico, and the US government's so panicked it won't even set foot in the area. You know, that's literally the story. It's not that the government helped the aliens supposedly get the base and set it all up. It's that we've been sort of unceremoniously kicked out and warned, don't ever come back. But when we dig into the story of Dulce, what we find is a lot of very strange activity in the area, which relates to this photograph. This photograph was taken by a Department of Energy employee in the early 1960s as a part of a program called Operation Gas Buggy. And Operation Gas Buggy was basically a plan to detonate deep underground small atomic devices with a view to releasing natural gas, which could be used as an energy. And a lot of people don't realise this, but only 12 miles from Dulce in 1967, the US Department of Energy actually detonated a small yield kiloton nuclear device below the forest. And that's not a matter of rumour or hearsay or anything. You can go on the internet and, you know, find the whole story. And if you go to the forest today, the Department of Energy have huge signs saying no digging underground and things like that without official permission, because one of the reasons, you know, you keep digging down and a radioactive device was detonated, you know, in a worst case scenario, who knows what you're going to sort of release. So if you Google Operation Gas Buggy and the 1967 detonation in the forest just 12 miles from Dulce, you'll find the story. And the official files on this, a number of them have now been declassified. So this is one of the things a lot of people find interesting. There's this story of an underground base, and only 12 in Dulce, and only 12 miles from Dulce, there are official signs from the Department of Energy warning people not to even consider digging underground. So on the one hand, you have people who say, no, this is just coincidence. You know, there's the Dulce base story here, and 12 miles away, the fact that the government was detonating things underground, you know, is just entirely coincidental. Other people in the sort of the more extreme end of the Dulce research field have sort of suspected the idea that maybe the nuclear explosion to release natural gas was a cover, and that the government panicked and actually set off this nuclear device to try and destroy the Dulce base, which goes into sort of another even weirder controversy then. But as I said, this is what keeps it open for many people, is the fact that we do know the military and the Department of Energy was doing some strange stuff in that area. On top of that, just a few years ago, the FBI declassified into the public domain, and you can now find these on their website, which is called The Vault, hundreds of pages on so-called cattle mutilations. I'm sure most of you have heard of the cattle mutilation mystery. The FBI's files, for the most part, which run to hundreds of pages, all focus on cattle mutilations in Dulce from 1975 to 1979. And so again, this has led people to think, well, why did all these cattle mutilations occur near Dulce? You know, is it a UFO link? A lot of people think cattle mutilations are sort of linked with UFO activity, alien activity. There was a police officer in the area named Gabe Valdez, who was one of the people who was basically consulted by the FBI because he was a New Mexico State police officer whose territory, whose area of investigation covered Dulce. And Gabe Valdez began digging and making contacts at Los Alamos and various other Sandia labs and places like this in New Mexico. And he came to believe that the cattle mutilations had nothing to do with aliens. He came to believe that the government was secretly testing cattle for fear that the radioactive contamination from the gas buggy test might have leaked out into the food chain, into the cattle, and then by default into the human food chain, which in many respects might be more disturbing than the idea that it was really alien. But then other people have said, and this is actually mentioned in the files, how the FBI interviewed Los Alamos people who said, no, this is alien, this is nothing to do with us. So, but again, the investigations, the mutilations, all focused in and around the Dulce area. So when you've got cattle mutilations, when you've got the FBI studying them, you've got people in the government saying there is a base there, you've got other people saying the cattle mutes are a cover for sort of biological testing, etc. And then we find, you know, there's all this underground nuclear blasting just down the road. This is the type of thing that really, you know, allows us at least to have a plausible reason, you know, for digging into these stories. You know, it's not just hearsay. It does sort of have some background to it. And that's a friend of mine, Greg Bishop. Greg's actually sat by the grave of a man named Paul Bennewitz. Paul Bennewitz was a UFO researcher in the 1970s and 80s he ran a company called Thunder Laboratories, which was based literally on the base perimeter of Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. And Bennewitz, I took that picture when we went to visit Bennewitz's grave a few years ago. Bennewitz, by his own admission, he was actually the first person to start talking about the Dulce base in the late 1970s, and ironically he went on record as saying that he got all his information from people working at Kirtland who knew about the existence of the base. Now people might say, well, you know, that's just his word. Why, you know, he's just saying something for the sake of saying it, looking for publicity, etc. That theory is sort of blown apart by the fact that Bennewitz was actually contracted to do work for the Air Force. They were actually one of his major contractors. And so, in other words, you know, to jeopardise his position by making up fake stories about what people at Kirtland were telling him could actually have resulted, you know, backfired in a loss of work. So I think the fact that he went on record as stating this is at least evidence that he was told the Dulce story. Now, again, the big question is how accurate is the Dulce story as it's told to us? Like the stories of Hangar 18, Area 51, they're sort of couched in, it could go this way, it could go that way, it could be a little bit of both. We're still digging sort of literally and metaphorically as well as when it comes to Dulce. Now, as I'm sure you can probably imagine, most of the,
Yeah, on the Kirtland base, wasn't that the basis for that the movie where the people were returned?
Which one?
They had been
Close Encounter?
what is it? No, where that big mountain. The guy kept making out a master.
Oh, Close Encounters. I'm not really sure about that.
I read that they based that the landing and everything else on Kirtland.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't know
They
that.
had a big landing there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a huge base. It's massive. A huge installation. Yeah. Now you might wonder why I've got a picture of the moon when we're talking about sort of classified installations. A lot of people have made claims, particularly people who sort of research outer space mysteries, NASA conspiracies, that sort of thing, that in addition to sort of the public visible space program which runs under the control of NASA, people have made claims that there could be sort of like a super secret space program that runs in tandem with NASA, controlled by the military. In other words, you know, we see today how NASA's sort of really scaling down its operations, and even its manned program, you know, is not necessarily say it's coming to an end, but it's been sort of really scaled down, you know, to where if we want to send astronauts up now, we've got to ask the Russians, you know, can we get a lift on one of your ships up into space? Which is kind of a sad situation, you know, sort of 43 years after, you know, first landed men on the moon, nearly half a century later, it's sort of, you know, got to ask the Russians, hey, you know, can you just send one of our guys up? And a lot of people in the conspiracy field actually don't believe that. They don't believe, you know, that we are just having to rely on the Russians. They feel that's sort of like a public image that's being nurtured to hide the fact that, or the theory I should say, that there's this clandestine military-controlled space program going on as well. And one of the theories is that there could be some sort of military installation on the moon. Now, that, again, that sounds fantastic and controversial. But through the terms of the Freedom of Information Act, and again you can find these documents online now, back in 1958 the US Army had a program called Project Horizon. And Project Horizon was a plan to basically militarize the moon. The idea was that if there was a war with the Soviets, and in a